Good evening, everyone. Members of the Chagla family who are present with us today, judges of this court, both past and present, my colleagues at the bar, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending this meeting held by the Bombay Bar Association in remembrance of our former president and senior member, Mr. Iqbal Chagla, who left us for his heavenly abode a month ago on Sunday, 12th of January, 2025. It is both an honor and a deeply moment for me to stand here today and share a few memories of Mr. Chagla, a legend of the Bombay High Court, a mentor to so many of us, and a man whose warmth and wisdom has touched countless lives. Mr. Chagla was a man of many passions. While his brilliance in the courtroom is well documented, those who were close to him knew about his love for music, especially Western classical and jazz. But what I remember most vividly were our conversations about football. In the morning, before court began at 11, we would often chat in the High Court Law Library, especially during major football tournaments like the World Cup or the Euros. We would discuss classic encounters that were played the previous night, games involving teams like Barcelona versus Real Madrid, or Manchester United and Arsenal or Liverpool. And it was during one of these conversations in 2011 that I hesitantly asked him if he'd consider sponsoring a rotating trophy in the memory of his father, Chief Justice Chagla, like he'd already instituted for cricket between judges and senior advocates. But this one would be for a lawyers' football tournament that I was planning on organizing at the Bombay Gymkhana. And without a moment's hesitation, he agreed. Immediately he asked me how much money would be needed. And before I could even return to chambers that evening, his check was already at my desk. That was Mr. Chagla, generous, decisive, and always supportive. And that's how the Chief Justice Chagla Trophy and the Lawyers Football Tournament into being in 2011, with about 8 teams that had participated. And now, in the last edition, there were 45 teams that have participated, all of them eyeing for the coveted Chief Justice Chagla Trophy. Initially, Mr. Chagla would always attend the prize distribution ceremonies. At times, he even came earlier in the evening to watch the finals of the game when Bombay Bar Association would play. However, soon after his son was elevated, he insisted that Justice Riaz Chagla should continue the legacy and give out the trophy, since young lawyers would prefer having the photographs clicked with a judge instead of an old lawyer. These moments revealed a side of him that not many knew, a man who loved sports, camaraderie, and the joy of competition. Mr. Chagla was also a mentor in the courtroom. I remember being briefed in the matter with him once. We'd had a conference the evening prior, but the next day he was caught up in another court. When the judge seemed reluctant to pass the matter over, my attorney asked me to start. 10 minutes in, Mr. Chagla walked in, and as any junior would, I immediately stopped my arguments and offered him the floor. Even the judge did not seem surprised and was happy to let him take over. But to everyone's surprise, especially mine, he calmly declined and asked the judge to let me continue. Sitting beside me, he gave me the confidence to finish my arguments, and thankfully the court ruled in our favor. That was a moment I will always remember. It wasn't just about winning the case, it was about trust and encouragement he showed me as a junior, something that I will always cherish. There are so many memories that I have of him. His impeccable suits that he wore to court, regardless of the weather, his broad-nibbed Sheffer fountain pen with which he would make his notes and mark his briefs, his separate conference room, a first for a counsel in those days, where he'd meet clients after court and after changing into a mufti dress and his carpet slippers. I remember Hemant, his man Friday, handing him his butterfly collar and bands in the library that he would wear before he strode out into court. These small details paint a picture of a man who was not only meticulous and professional but also deeply human. Mr. Chagla was more than a brilliant lawyer. He was a mentor, a guide, and a friend. His legacy lives on, not just in the cases that he won or the precedents that he set, but in the lives that he touched and the values he instilled in all of us. Today, as we remember, I am filled with gratitude for the time I shared with him. He will be deeply missed, but his spirit will continue to inspire us. I would now like to call upon the President of the Bombay Bar Association, Mr. Nitin Thakkar, to address the gathering. Mr. Thakkar.
Members of the family of Mr. Iqbal Chagla, senior advocates, my friends. I have two memories to share of Iqbal. One, I saw in court a jugalbandi of sorts between two lovers of pipe smoking, Justice Lentin and Mickey. It happened that in courtroom number 37, Justice Lentin was presiding. Suddenly his board collapsed and Mickey was summoned to come from library, and he came running, and pipe was in his hands. So Mickey entered the court, but pipe and the pouch were in his hands. He placed them beside the stand and he started arguing the matter. After a few minutes, Justice Lentin was very uncomfortable and he said, "Mr. Chagla, please remove that tempting thing from my view." And of course, Mickey obliged. So that I saw that there are two people who are very fond of pipes and they loved that thing. Second thing which I remember was our trip to Finland. And of course, I will also remember. During one summer vacation, I asked Rohit Kapadia where he was planning to go, and he said that me and Mickey are planning to go to Finland. Then I said, I am also going to Finland. There is a Young Lawyers International Conference executive committee meeting and I am going there. But then I walked up to Mickey and told him, "You are a president, and as an IJA member, I want to hold an event in Mumbai in association with Bombay Bar Association. So if you also join me to attend that executive committee meeting for one day, it will be beneficial to you in terms of it becomes an official trip for you, and we can organize a meeting in Bombay." He agreed immediately. He liked the idea, and we had then met the executive committee and planned that meeting on 6th of December 1992 in Bombay on environmental law, where we had invited Justice Verma and Justice Kuldeep Singh. Now, the reason why I am recounting this incident in connection with this is that the previous evening we had a dinner for Mr. Ashok Desai and Tempton Andhyarujina, they having been appointed as Attorney General of India and Solicitor General of India. And in that very dinner, these two judges, uninvited, dropped in. And that famous, the Last Supper happened on that day. And so coincidentally, that trip became sort of a starting point for saving of original site by some 15-20 years thereafter. Of course, thereafter we had a trip to Rowanna from, and we saw the sunset at 11:30 at night, and Santa Claus also. The last thing which I want to say is, one, I am thankful to Roshan and Mickey for having agreed to record that message which you played on our podcast trailer. It was very gracious of Mickey to agree to do that, because at that time he was finding very difficult to speak also. But still he managed to record that his message to us, and I'm really indeed grateful to him. My greatest regret will be that I was not able to have a full podcast of Mickey recorded, which all of us had agreed that we will have a full podcast of Mickey to be recorded, but then we found that his health was not to do that. And lastly, so many memories of Mickey. Justice Chagla had roses in December. I request the family, we should have jasmine in January. Thank you.
I'd now like to call upon Jahan Mehta to share a few memories.
Roshan Aunty, members of the family, judges, there is a certain romance to the idea of a lawyer, a person who stands for what he believes in and refuses to yield, whether to mediocrity, temptation, or intimidation. Impossibly elegant in his advocacy, he holds the respect of his colleagues, the bench, his clients. He's armed only with a deep-rooted sense of justice, tempered with compassion, and he charms and disarms all around him with his intellect, commanding presence, and sense of fair play as he glides effortlessly from court to court. This is an idea, but there is no one who embodied this ideal more than the man we are here to remember today. Enough is known about his courageous actions while leading the bar. I did not have the privilege of those times and those years. I joined him during what he called the autumnal dusk of his career. I was already in awe of him. I intended to join the bar and asked to call on him. He graciously invited me to chambers for tea, and in what I learned was typical of him, we spoke about everything but the law. We spoke about our love for history, literature, jazz, cricket, poetry, art, and the rolling grasslands of England. At the end of it, he slapped the table with his hand in his trademark manner and said, "Right." That was his way of saying it was time to move on. And that was that. I joined his chambers shortly after, and I was lucky enough to have those last few years with him. What struck me about him was his innate dignity and the humility with which he carried himself. He was undoubtedly the doyen of the Bombay bar, and yet he was as irreverent as he was revered, something he inherited from his own senior, Karshidji Baba, whose stories he would recount with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. He insisted on his juniors calling him by his first name, and he only threw in the towel on that particular tradition once I pointed out to him that his first reported judgment was in the same year my parents were born. Slowly and with some unease, he became accustomed to being called Sir. But to him, no one was infallible, least of all himself, and he enjoyed both banter and being teased at the daily evening teas. Once it was time to work, though, he would demand the highest from himself and from others. What I had perceived in court as an almost magical felicity with words and peerless courtcraft was, in fact, the product of hours of meticulous and painstaking preparation where every fact was uncovered and every question of law analyzed to his exacting standards. Even judgments that were in our favor were discarded if he felt the rationale behind them was erroneous. He diligently marked his briefs with his now infamous, barely legible black scrawls, and it would be left to us and some poor solicitor to try and make sense of them so that we could assist him appropriately. To his juniors, he was a mentor, a friend, and a father figure. He treated us all like independent professionals and celebrated our wins. And it was to him we went to guidance in matters both professional and personal. He always pushed us to explore interests beyond law and have a life outside the courtroom. He believed in a well-balanced life filled with hues and colors of every kind, and this was something he practiced. He was devoted to his family. He was a man of many, many interests. In a career spanning over 60 years, it is only apt that there are in fact generations between some of his juniors. And yet, despite the decades between him and some of his juniors, he was always approachable. There is a story I must recount, if only because I am still somewhat in shock it happened in the first place. I had just joined Chambers and was trying to find my feet. I received a brief in a field of law which at that point I knew very little about. I shared this with him in excitement and rushed to the commentaries to begin researching. 20 minutes later, he called me to his room and handed me this tiny piece of paper. On it, scrawled in black ink, were a list of judgments. He simply handed them over to me and said, "These will help." I was stunned. Such was the measure of the man. He is no longer with us, and I cannot help but feel that we are at the passing of an age of reckless bravery, unflinching civility, and romantic idealism. There are no condolences to offer for him. He would not wish it so. He did not believe in an afterlife. The last time I saw him was when some of us enjoyed a glass of his favorite single malt together with him one evening in the hospital. So I will instead raise that glass later on tonight to a life well lived and remember this extraordinary man whose stories will be told for generations to come. He was a great lawyer, a thorough gentleman, but most importantly, he was a good man. He will be missed and he will be remembered.
Thank you, Jehan. I'd now like to call upon Mr. Rashmikant to address the gathering.
Roshan, Rohika, Riaz, and colleagues, friends. I must say that I'm quite emotional at the moment. Pardon my being emotional. I was a first-year law student, government law college, when I had joined the profession in Mathubai Jamatram as an intern. And from the very first year in 73, I used to meet Iqbal with matters which were there because he was a pet counsel in Mathubai Jamatram. I met him for small matters and high-stake matters also. As a result, my interactions with him gave me a lot of confidence of what more I can do. To that extent, I took a decision to start the firm Federal and Rashmikant. And if at all I had that confidence, it was in terms of, okay, look, I'll be able to do better. And to that extent, I can remember when we took a 100 square feet office in Esplanade Mansion, Iqbal came for that inauguration for the office, gave that confidence. But that was only the beginning. Then we went to a larger premises, Bilkis Mansion, then Secretariat Chambers, and Kalpatru. But I must say, for each of the offices, Iqbal was there to inaugurate each of these offices, knowing me growing. He said, "You're growing." When I had to go for my arbitration to Germany, he kind of gave me a lot of ideas in terms of how I can take care, the weather, how cold it will be, what you should do, what kind of warm clothing you should take, and that's the way, that was Iqbal. For me, it's quite a personal kind of thing, the way I've grown from 1973 and where I have grown from strength to strength, thanks to Iqbal. And for me, it's a different experience at a personal level as a friend. Because Iqbal in his centenary, that edition of Roses in December, he talked about him being the midwife for the book Roses in December, where he had given the idea to late Justice Chagla to have that to write that book. But in that centenary volume, he did mention that he was a midwife for that book itself. If I look at it, he was a midwife for that book. He was a midwife, at least to me, for the firm which has grown. And I would look at, I don't know how many others in the profession have been literally taken care of and have grown, mentored and whatever. And he has been more than a friend, a mentor, and for too many things that one can't kind of ever think about, because the memories keep flowing all the time and one can't help it but keep thinking about it. But I would say we'd have to live with these memories which help us to be better people it can be. That's my experiences with him, more personal than otherwise, yeah.
I'd now like to call upon Elias Khambata to come and share a few memories.
Roshan, Rohika, Justice Chagla, Nilofer, Justice Puniwala, Justice Doctor, Justice Patel. Friends, it is particularly difficult for me to stand here at this lectern where Mickey stood so often and addressed us to speak of him. And I do not think I will be able to speak of my truly personal interactions with him, because in my mind, he is not gone. He is very much here with us. He's probably sitting at his table right outside, or he's somewhere here listening to this meeting in his celebration. There is so much to share, but today I've decided to therefore focus him as a lawyer. First, his discipline, which Farhan spoke about, his impeccable three-piece wing collar, last button on the waistcoat always undone. And when it was time to return to chambers, inevitably off came the bands, on came on his Cambridge tie, and it was a discipline he followed for as long as I can remember. But let me tell you about how he conducted his conferences. And I'm going way back to 1985, 1986 in the old chambers in the annex. His conferences were always methodical and extensive. First, the dates. He would jot these down with his thick-nibbed Scheffer fountain pen in what looked like Japanese calligraphy to most. Very artistic, but indecipherable. And this was usually the quiet phase of the conference, where you could see him weighing every document or date he was supplied with in the balance. What was its weight? Silent puffs of smoke filled the room with the aroma of sweet and warm tobacco. The room was lit with patchy yellow light from a reading lamp. And in the old chambers, he sat amidst a pile of musty red string briefs, classic Dickens atmosphere. Then came the second phase of the conference, the law. This was far more engaging. Mickey was the quintessential barrister. He relied on legal principle rather than some authority. This was a far sounder approach, since he could and did, as Jehan has told us, often question poorly written precedents even when they were in his favor. He favored well-reasoned judgments, preferably in purple prose, and Jimmy found so many of them for us. He loved the hunt for the finest legal writing, and each matter was marked with a relentless, sometimes frenetic search for authorities. That never ended. If poorly written, he would recount how the Court of Appeal would start its judgment in appeal from a judge it did not hold in high regard, quoting, "This is an appeal from the decision of Justice Kekovich," and that marked the demise of that judgment in appeal. Similarly for Mickey, a curt shake of the head was enough to kill an authority. The final phase of preparation was most often alone, at home, in his study later that evening, perhaps fueled by a tumbler of his favorite single malt. And all of us then witnessed the following day or week an immaculately structured argument that was always elegant and compelling, and delivered in high style, in impeccable, unaccented English. Certainly the finest English I've heard from a non-Englishman. And he was truly, I think, the last Englishman to practice at our bar here. He had already achieved fame and a huge practice when I joined him, and one heard of how he had taken on the entire bar a few years earlier in the Killick-Nixon case, a case that he told me was bristling with law points. But I had the time of my life with him, in many cases bristling with law points and a huge amount of fun. I don't want to list them, but I remember the first one. It was for the International Airports Authority against Khambata Aviation. Then the DuPont Orke matters with Janak and he in Ahmedabad. We spent several weeks. The Grinleys matter again with Janak and him. Britannia, Patel Engineering, Indian Express, Gaikwad, Bombay Gas, Coke, Pepsi, and a host of others. Many of these traverse several months and even years. And he would expect you to know your legal principles and to be ready with your work. I remember in the Orke matter, he suddenly turned to me, a rank raw junior, and said, "Get the substantial compliance cases or procedures, the handmaiden of justice. Can I have some judgments to cite?" And those were the days when you had no keyword research. The latest books were not readily available. The latest editions were not readily available. And to hide my panic, when I ultimately did find some judgments, I used to note them down in a notebook. So the next time around he asked me, I would nonchalantly say, "Of course, Mickey, those cases," and would supply him with what he wanted. But if you did ask him how you should look up and where you should look up, he would always guide and encourage you. He never actually pulled us up for shoddy work, but his quiet tone stiffened, and that was enough. You knew you had not performed up to par. There was no matter he didn't slave over. Not for him the flashy, unprepared histrionics. His was a measured and prepared approach. But the end result was always devastating and appeared effortless. Buttressed by brilliant advocacy and witty, often scary party. I recall a moment in a very contested corporate litigation which had gone on for days. The opposing senior was in full flight, and when an affidavit was thrust before him, unwittingly an affidavit made by his own client, and his junior pointed to a paragraph, and the senior said, "Is this a denial? This is just a bare denial. No denial in law whatsoever." And at that point, instead of gloating, Mickey just rose to his full imperious height and said, "Milord, in a heavily contested matter, that is the one point on which I and my learned friend are in complete harmony." That was it. That was all he had to say. So that was his style. It was understated but devastating, and always polite. I rate many of his performances as great. For me personally, and I think Janak will remember that, was his cross-examination in an arbitration, the ANZ Grinley's arbitration, where the opposing side's only witness stepped into the box thinking he knew all, And Mickey reduced him from the arrogance of those early days to a whimpering shambles at the end. Slow, meticulous, and masterfully executed cross-examination. Janak and I worked with him for the whole month of May in that matter, but what a performance he rendered. A case was created from absolutely nothing, all without histrionics or even eloquent oratory. Of course, his oratory was unmatchable and often swept the court off its feet. Yet at the end of day's play, he would often return to chambers and would have a hearty laugh at himself and at his own client, saying the client has got carried away by today's argument, let's bring him down to earth again. His feet were always firmly on the ground. He took his work very seriously, but not himself. And he never forgot that he was the court's officer first, only then his client's spokesman. Traveling on work with him was an utter treat. In those days, travel was at a statelier pace. It was invariably a 2 or 3 day trip, sometimes even longer. The evenings were the part I looked forward the most. If he had a friend in port, and he had in most, then I would tag along for that dinner, which abounded with good cheer and very happy recounting of memories. I remember the Heredias at Divar Island in Goa, the Sarabhais in Ahmedabad, outdoor dinners with Janak at Vishala, Gulatis in Pandara market. This is endless. He was always polite to the court. I remember once I cornered him in Delhi, years later, with a solicitor to ask him at the very last moment to appear for a final hearing before the Company Law Board. He had argued the case before, but his brief and notes were in Mumbai. And this was again an era bereft of email, rapid couriers and iPads. When he expressed his inability, because it was a heavy final hearing, the solicitor retorted, and I'll never forget this, any counsel can argue with a brief, but you can argue without one. It's the only time I've seen Mickey rendered absolutely speechless. And he had to succumb, and he went on to argue brilliantly for the entire day before the CLB, without his notes, without his own brief, etc. He did have his vengeance on me for that one. Years later, on a cold winter's day, I remember bumping into him at the Taj Mansingh lobby. I'd just gone up for one day for a conference, no court clothes, no change. And I was leaving, and he said, when are you going back? And I said, this evening. He said, no, you're not. You're going to stay here. The Z matter is on. I need your assistance. So I was suddenly yanked into it. He said, you go get your togs and things like that, and we'll have a drink this evening and discuss the matter. That's how easy he was to deal with. And of course, he then put in a huge amount of effort. That was that with him. The club lounge at the Taj Mansingh was a favorite watering hole. And years later, just last year in fact, I remember the staff asked me, how is Mr. Chagla? They so fondly inquired after him. And of course, I told him about that, and I think he was happy to hear that. He was not just the complete man. There's so much to say about him, and we've said it and written it. But he was also a textbook for ethics and principle, and the complete professional. I recall a matter where Janak and I were assisting him at length. And though his contribution was immense, he was not treated fairly by the client, and he returned the brief. Janak and I immediately went to him saying, we too were returning our briefs. He would have nothing of that. He said, absolutely not, and I still his words. He said, we are professionals, we are not a trade union. And he insisted that Janak and I continue. Even today, when I'm faced with a difficult decision, a life's choice, I ask myself what two people would have done, my father and Mickey, and I will continue to do so until my last days. I was privileged to have had him as a senior. He was the kindest, most generous senior one could have. I may truly not have remained at the bar, but for his constant support, advice, and guidance. There were many moments which I can recall. But today is not the occasion that I should or want to go into them. He molded me not only as a lawyer, but as a human being. So whilst our ears may no longer hear that smooth and rich baritone, our hearts and minds will resonate with his tone and tenor. I will always hear the sound of him knocking his pipe bowl to clear it, or the clearing of his throat, and secure therefore in the knowledge that he will never leave the portals of this building I can only say this. Now cracks a noble heart. Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angel sing thee to thy rest.
I'd now like to call upon our last speaker, Janak Dwarkadas.
Riaz, Roika, and Roshan. Before coming here to speak, I asked myself several times, what is it that Mickey would have liked to be remembered as? I can tell you without any hesitation that he would have loved to recount and have a hearty laugh at all the legendary stories of Chamber Number 1, which we shared and recounted numerous, almost ad nauseum, in our chambers. Many of these stories are unprintable, but not all of them. I will try and recount them because they bring back many of the happy memories that we shared, the laughter that Daraz spoke about, which still resonates at the back of my mind, and how happy he felt even 10 or 12 days before he passed away, when I went to see him at the Breach Candy Hospital, and we recounted, and I recounted some of the stories, and he was the Mickey we always knew. I would like to first share with you how my relationship with Mickey began. It was my father who introduced me to him. He sat me down and he said, "Look, young man, I want you to know one thing. You'll address me by my first name, Mickey." That came as a big shock to me. Then he said, "You're here because you're joining a profession. We are equals. You're here because you want to be in the profession, and I'm here because I want to be in this profession. I'm not your headmaster, I'm not a teacher, I will not be taking any attendance. You can come when you like, you can leave when you like, you don't need any permission. These are my briefs. You can read whichever one that takes your fancy. If you don't want, you need not read them. You can follow me around in the courts and you can attend my conferences, unless, of course, it's confidential." I almost felt that I wasn't required and that he was giving some other message to me to say that, "Why are you here?" But I realized that there was so much truism and so much merit in what he said, because what he wanted was that all professionals should learn to stand on their own feet and not be mollycoddled. I have followed this piece of advice and mentorship. I think I must have said this to almost all the juniors who joined me thereafter, and I think it was a wonderful piece of advice. I cannot forget the very first time that we were celebrating a victory of sorts at an apartment somewhere near Breach Candy, where we had succeeded in getting a very good order from the court, and Mickey, Jimmy, Freddie, all of us were there. And Mickey was, of course, having a single malt. And he said, "Won't you have a drink? After all, we are celebrating." I had never had alcohol till that day. And looking at him and the pleasure he seemed to be deriving from it, I went ahead and had a glass or two. But he was concerned. I used to ride a bike those days. He quietly told Jimmy, follow him to his house, see that he gets home safely. That was a concern he did. And I'll never forget that even though he introduced me to the single malt, which I love till date, he did it with great caution. In chamber number 1, we had so many stories that we would recount, and like little children would laugh at them, which probably nobody other than us would understand why we were laughing. They would be recounted here outside on the lunch table at 2:30. Maybe the same would be recounted again at 4:45 for the tea break. But I've never heard Mickey ever say, "Oh, I've heard this before, forget it, let's get on with work." He used to love a good laugh, and he loved to recount those stories, and he never minded us recounting them. Like, I'll never forget, we had a pune called Bhiva, who we called the grumbler. He had a perennial frown on his face, and every time he entered the chamber, he would be mumbling, complaining, God knows for what. We just used to love observing him. Mickey in particular would kind of nudge us and point to him and say, there goes Bhiva, and kind of, So one particular afternoon, I remember, one of our colleagues, Sandeep Thakur, had his briefs in the cubicle in Karsiji Baba's chamber. And Karsiji used to take some rest in the afternoon. So those days were landline phones. Sandeep had a matter at 2:30. So he must have called and told Bhiva, "Get my brief." So Bhiva came, tried to open Karsiji Baba's door. It was locked. So he left. 5 minutes later, Sandeep called again. Again he pushed the door. Again it was locked. Again he mumbled something and left. The third time he came and he said in Marathi, "Sagre kaam kartat," means everybody else is working. This old man is sleeping. What can I do? This man is asking for his brief. What can I do? And we had such a hearty laugh because I don't know what, in fact, even when I recount it today, it may not sound as funny, but in our chambers, I thought we never forgotten this story, and we must have recounted it n number of times because Bhiva was quite a character. There was Santosh, a young man who had joined our chambers as a pune. He was very respectful, particularly to Mickey. I think in Bihar. One day somehow Mickey discovered that he was a Christian. So come Christmas, and Mickey said, "Merry Christmas, Santosh." So Santosh looks at Mickey and says, "Saab, ji, मैं क्रिश्चियन नहीं हूँ." So Mickey said, "आप तो बोला क्रिश्चियन है." "नहीं जी, हम कभी ऐसे बोला ही नहीं, मैं तो हिंदू हूँ." "आप पहले बोला क्रिश्चियन है, आप हिंदू है, क्या है? आपका नाम क्या है?" "साहब, मेरा नाम तो सुनील है." As if suddenly, he transformed from one religion to the other. The other story about Santosh was that Mickey somehow found him the most reliable to buy him tickets for the cinema. In those days, there used to be cinema houses, and we used to go there. And I think probably Santosh had decided that the most romantic and eternally romantic couple was Roshan and Mickey. So whenever he would be asked to go and get cinema tickets for Mickey, invariably you would end up buying the two cornermost seats in the theatre. And Mickey would, I don't know what's wrong with this guy. Every bloody time I'm sitting in the corner there. It used to be such great fun. And I remember the times when, as Jahan has said, Darius has spoken, our chambers, I always wondered how we ever got any work done. It used to be full of fun. There would be so many things happening at the same time. Somebody could be playing chess in one corner. Somebody could be listening to some music. Whilst in that sense court could be on. Then somebody would be looking at the horse racing book, trying to get tips for the races that were coming up. And talking about races, Mickey was known to have the worst luck in horse racing. But it never stopped us to form a syndicate. So 8 or 10 of us would get together and put 10 rupees down on the table till we collected about 100 rupees. So I had a bike in those days. I would be sent off on a working day because there would be racing on Wednesdays or Thursdays. I think Jimmy would know better. And we would buy 10 jackpot tickets of 10 rupees each. We never won a jackpot. But that was because Mickey was always part of the syndicate. And Mickey's luck was notorious. So one day, to break the jinx, he went up to Ghulam, who used to sit on the table, library table across from him. Ghulam, give me a winner. I'm going to break this jinx. I want a winner. So Ghulam said, if you want a certainty, back Manitou. Manitou can never lose. So my uncle Damodar used to be there, regular race goer. He would be going on Sundays. He took out his wallet, he gave 10 or 20 rupees to my uncle, and he says, place my bet on Manitou. So Damodar said, there's no point, you won't get. I don't care, I want to place my bet on Manitou. What about the odds? No, I must get. So finally, Manitou won, and we were all flabbergasted. He never won a race. One day, very proudly, he comes to the library. He's waiting for Damodar to come. And he's waiting there, and he says, where are my winnings? So Damodar said, but I never backed the horse. So he says, what do you mean you didn't back it? He says, it was money back. What's the point of backing a horse where you get your money back? So his luck in that sense remained intact, and he, till the end, never won a single race. Talking of riding a bike, Mickey was very unpretentious. I think one of the days when Roshan probably was not able to come, Roshan was there every evening to fetch him, take him home. Sometimes when Mickey would be running late, we would go and give her company while she was waiting in the car. So one day it just so happened that Roshan couldn't make it. Mickey was about to leave. He says, you have a bike, don't you? I said, yeah. Give me a ride. I said, are you sure? Of course. So he was wearing his black coat, tie, smoking his pipe, sat pillion, and Jimmy remarked, "It's the first chauffeur-driven bike I have seen." I'll tell you another story. I'm going to tell you a few stories just to show you how diverse our chambers used to be and what a great time we used to have. There was a particular matter where a client was extremely nervous. I think there was some summary suit or something was filed against him. I introduced the client to Mickey because he was related to some family member. We had a couple of conferences in the chambers. So Mickey used to come down from court, and as he would settle down, he would remove his jacket and remove his tie, then look for, perennially looking for his pipe, and he'd find the pipe. Then after the pipe would be found, you would not find the companion, then he may not find the pipe cleaner, then you look for his tobacco, which would be in this pocket or the other one, or maybe left behind in the jacket, so the pune would be called. It would take a good 7 to 8 minutes before Mickey would settle down, fill his pipe with the tobacco, clean it, light it, smoke the first few puffs. And not that he wasn't paying attention, but the client was convinced that till he took those 2 puffs, Mickey was not focused. So he must have observed this 2 or 3 times. The 4th time we were to meet, which was the day prior to the hearing, and he was really tense. He came a little early and he says, "If you don't mind, I'll just go down to the tobacconist and get a brand new pipe, a Dunhill pipe, tobacco, pipe cleaner, companion, matchbox, keep it all ready for him so that the minute he settles down, I'll light it for him and let him take his 2 puffs, and then we will start the conference immediately." I cannot, I shared this with Mickey, and I cannot tell you how much he laughed at it, and he would ask me to recount that story often enough because he loved it, and he loved to laugh at himself. He loved a good joke. He could really enjoy himself. As Daraj said, Mickey would always take his work very seriously, and you could tell. There would be a huge transformation between Mickey sharing jokes at the tea club, Mickey sharing jokes here at the lunch table, and Mickey back at his table, work table. There would be virtually 2 different people. But that's what he was. He took his work seriously, but never himself. He always loved a good laugh, and he didn't mind if the joke was on him. And that's how we knew him throughout. His love for photography is too well known. During COVID, he in fact put together a phenomenal copy book full of photographs taken by him of the lovely house that Roshan and Mickey have built in Khandala called La Quinta. It's such a lovely book, and he did it all during COVID because he couldn't, obviously none of us could go out, and he of course had to be more careful because of his health issues. I would love to see that book one day again and be reminded of all the good times that Roshan and Mickey have given us at La Quinta. We used to go there almost every monsoon and enjoy the greenery around us in the valley. There was a brook that actually flowed by the house, and it was such a magnificent sight and a lovely afternoon that we have, many lovely afternoons that we have spent over there. I'm sure wherever Mickey is today, he's having a good chuckle at all these stories. All that I would like to say is, thank you, Mickey, for the good times you have given us. Thank you.
It is often said that the legacy of a great person is not measured by the wealth they accumulate or the titles they hold, but by the lives they touch, the wisdom they impart, and the light they leave behind for others to follow. Having known Mr. Chagla and seeing so many of you here today to honor his memory, I have no doubt that his legacy will live on forever, not just in the courtrooms he graced, but in the hearts and minds of all those who were fortunate enough to know him. With this, we conclude today's event. On behalf of the Bombay Bar Association and the members of the Chagla family, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this meeting today. Have a good evening.